Good evening. Welcome to Washington National Cathedral. My name's Randy Hollerith, and I'm the Dean of the Cathedral, and it is a real pleasure for us tonight to be able to host this evening of conversation and celebration around Bishop Budde's new book, How We Learn to Be Brave. Personally, I can't think of many things we need more in our world today than principled bravery. So we're glad you're joining us for this important evening. My thanks to the Bishop for being with us and doing this, and also my thanks to the canon historian of the Cathedral, John Meacham. It's always great to have John in the house. A couple of housekeeping bits for you. We hope you all will join us for a reception following this conversation in the back of the nave. All are welcome. Also, Bishop Mariann will be signing books in the back of the nave, and there are books to purchase from Politics and Prose for all those who are interested. Finally, the conversation will end with questions from the audience. So if you have a question that you would like to put to the bishop, you will see a QR code on your bulletin that you can scan and input your question, and then they will all be shared with John Meacham for possible discussion. So please feel free to add those questions. Now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Bishop Mariann Budde and John Meacham.
Your Grace. No one calls me that. It's terrible. I tried to get Hollerith to do it, but he won't at all. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Reverend Dean. Bishop, why don't you start us off with a passage from the sacred text? She was going to publish it all in red letters, but we talked her out of it.
Thank you all for being here tonight. It's just really lovely of you to be here, and I'm honored to share this night with you. So this is from the introduction. There have been many decisive moments in my life, but few as public as what happened on June 1st, 2020. To be honest, I didn't have time to think. Urged on by horrified church colleagues who were watching the president walk to St. John's Church on live television and lighting up my phone with texts, I managed to find my voice and speak. The president's actions touched a societal nerve, as did my speaking out against them. It seemed to others that I was being very brave. In truth, it felt more like being summoned to take my place alongside others who were being brave. Something had to be said, not just about that presidential moment, but the moment we were in as a nation, mourning the murder of George Floyd, watching crowds pour into the streets in cities across the nation, and facing yet again the need for racial reckoning. Because of my position, I had the opportunity to speak and be heard. The capacity to respond in such a moment doesn't drop from the sky, nor is its significance measured by a week's worth of media coverage. Moments like these are preceded by seasons of preparation, practice, and intention, of making countless daily decisions that determine our capacity to be brave when called upon, or when we're summoned not of our own choosing. Its ultimate significance is determined by how we live after the moment passes. The more personally decisive moment for me in that dramatic week took place a few days after President Trump's infamous photo op. I was back on what was now called Black Lives Matter Plaza in front of St. John's Church, listening to the words of the Reverend Dr. William J. Barber II. Bishop Barber is co-chair of the Poor People's Campaign, a broad-based effort to mobilize low-income people of all races and their allies to create a more just society. Bishop Barber looked out on the wonderfully multiracial, intergenerational crowd gathered on that Sunday afternoon and said, "Do not let anyone tell you that this is the first time people of different races, classes, and educational backgrounds have come together to fight for a common cause. It has always been such a coalition of the faithful that has brought about change in this country. Black, white, and brown, rich and poor, young and old. Everyone is needed. Everyone has a part to play and an offering to make." As he spoke, the weight I had been carrying all week seemed to fall off my shoulders, and in that moment, I knew my place in the larger struggle for justice. I heard myself say to God and to the universe, I want to be among the coalition of the faithful. I want to be among those working for the change we need now. That's a decision with which I need to align my life every day. It's not a new thought for me, but I felt it in a new way. It won't burn in my heart the way it did that week always, but I don't want to forget it. Like everyone else, I need grace, courage, and perseverance to be true to my decisive moment after the passion fades. As decisive as that week was for many of us as Americans, and a marking series of events for us as a nation, it would be a mistake to conclude that all decisive moments are as public. Indeed, most of the defining moments of life never make the news cycle. It's critically important not to become accustomed to the spotlight of an audience in such moments and confuse the short-lived attention of others for the kind of change our decisive moments invite us to embrace. Most decisive moments are personal. Some are private. Yet all are the moments that shape our lives and make us the people we are and who God calls us to become.
Thank you. You mentioned there the difficulty of sustaining passion in tranquility, or at least relative tranquility, which is a little like the great story from Tom Sawyer where an evangelist comes to town who was so good that even Huck Finn was saved until Tuesday. So on the Mark Twain principle, how do you stay saved past Tuesday?
Indeed. I feel in some ways we need to come to terms with the letdown that happens after the adrenaline fades. And there's a feeling, in my experience, I describe it as emptiness. When the rush is over and you've done the thing, whatever it is, personal or public, big or small, and there's this long stretch afterwards when not much seems to be happening. And in some ways, I feel like those moments are just as important in the sense that we're learning to live by intention rather than by adrenaline. And we're trying to call to mind, and maybe that's why we need the rituals of spirituality and of life, and to just keep us focused on those moments that we want to live our lives as if they are true by, even when we don't feel it. And I just was thinking of a beautiful song that is written with a brief refrain from presumably someone who was in a concentration camp during the Second World War, and the refrain is simply, I believe in the sun even when the sun is not shining. I believe in love even when I don't feel it, and I believe in God even when God is silent. But that presupposes moments when the sun was shining and you did feel love, and God wasn't silent. But you also are invariably going to have those other times. The Jesuits call it, I think, consolation and desolation. It's the rhythm of a grounded life. And to persevere, I think you need to make your peace with that. And I tried to write about that because I feel like that's kind of the dirty secret about it all. Like, we don't talk about those days of no drama as being decisive in their own way.
Now you have a day job, right? Here we are. Why take the pains to write this book now?
One of the great blessings of my life was, in June of 2020, I was contacted by these two remarkable women who are here today. And they, from a literary agency, Jennifer Gates and Catherine Strong, and they simply asked me if there was anything that I could write about in a book, what would it be? And I think I knew almost immediately that I would love the opportunity to explore in depth these moments, because I've been really thinking about them all my life, certainly living my own version of them. I've always been a student of other people's lives and how they find courage, inspired by the long, courageous stretches of history when people seem to be passing the baton from one generation to the next to keep a dream alive. To have the opportunity to write about that and to broaden the lens, as we were talking earlier, of what constitutes a decisive moment and what happens to lead up to it. How do you prepare? And then how does it land, and what happens later? Also, what constitutes a decisive moment? There are the ones, as I said earlier, that are dramatic, and then there are the ones that are really private, but no less of a crisis in the best sense of the word when they occur. So to have an opportunity to reflect on that. I had their help, which was lovely. I would, you probably don't remember this, the two of you, but I would write whatever I thought was, the ideas, and they'd come back and they'd say, well, that's a really good start, Mariann. Now what we need you to do is to flesh it out further. And I think that went on for about a year before we even got to a proposal. And it was just the process of reflecting. I won't say it was easy. There were long stretches when I had to get up early in the morning and do the work, but I never lost sight of the privilege and the opportunity to go deeper with themes that have been close to my heart all my life.
Did you find, I find this all the time, I don't actually know what I think until I'm writing, and sometimes I don't even know after that, but that's a different story. I suspect you found, and I wonder, comparing it to your preaching, did you know what the destination looked like? Or did you have to construct it as you went along?
I never know what the destination looks like. I have some sense, I had some sense because I had reflected and thought on some themes before, but I would say, and I don't know, I think I'm actually you may feel that way, but I feel like I feel that way more because of the way I never really learned how to write in a structured way. And so most of my learning to write came late in life, and I lean very heavily still on the intuitive side of my brain rather than the logical side. And the logic I discover the logic later, and then I have to go back and clean it up, and I also write thousands of drafts for what will ultimately be 5 pages. So it's it's a pretty messy process. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone, but I think every person has their, I'm in my 60s now. It's not probably going to change, but it is a revelatory process. And there are moments. There are those moments when the words come, and then there are like long stretches when you're just wondering, right, how it's gonna flow. Yeah.
Define bravery. When you talk about being brave, what do you mean? And by the way, we're going to try to do this, whenever we talk, we're going to have the chimes going in the background. So it's very elevating.
My favorite, there are many definitions of courage or bravery, but my favorite is Eleanor Roosevelt's, when you are called to do the very thing you think you cannot do, or that you've never done before. And there's an element of excitement sometimes, fear others, but this sense of being summoned or compelled to go past the threshold of whatever is your known experience, which is deeply embedded in human development. If you think about a young child and when they take their first steps, or when you watch them master a skill that they hadn't learned even the day before, just the look on their faces, they're just astonished, that I'm walking or I'm riding a bicycle, right? We all have that in us, but that's how I experience the process of courage. It's the proverbial walking on water or stepping into the unknown. So I think that's where I would land. How would you define it?
I think it was Aristotle who said that, and so if you're going to quote somebody, I'm going to pull him out. He was a pagan. Can I mention him? Is that okay? Is that right? Courage is the most important virtue because it guarantees all the others. Right? And so I think in a more historical sense, human narrative sense, I think Mrs. Roosevelt was right, as she often was, so often was, that it's the capacity to do that which is uncomfortable because the dictates of conscience suggest it's the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And if it were easy, we wouldn't call it courage.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
What is in your mind, the scriptural theological origins of courage? It's as old as Joshua, right? Be strong and of a good courage.
Right. That's what I love. I love a lot of things about Scripture. We can talk theology in a bit, but for Scripture, what is so encouraging is the stories of people who do exactly what we've just described. And it goes all the way back to Abraham, who was summoned by God to leave his homeland and go to another without knowing why. And the text doesn't tell us how he felt or how Sarah, his wife, felt when they were summoned. They didn't know drama. They just get up and go. And so there is that sense. And so there are some in Scripture that are called to go and do brave things, and others are called to stay where they are and be faithful. Others most are persuaded in the beginning that they're not worthy of whatever call it is that is before them. So lots of room for identification there. One of the things I love most about the scriptural people that are revealed to us is that even when they do something really brave and wonderful, on the very next page, they just mess it up completely, right? So there's this sense of like, even when you get it completely right, the next day you may fall flat on your face, and then you get back up again, and you keep on going. So there's this long arc of a history of God calling upon human beings in all of our frailty and glory, asking us to do brave things. And when we say yes, we're part of something that is bigger than we are. and our full humanity is always taken into account. So that's, for me, that's the foundation scripturally. When thinking theologically, thinking about how God views us in that, there's a realm of mystery there that I'm not sure that I have complete insight into, except we seem to be wired by God for this kind of life,
Well, I've always thought it was particularly poetic that the chief apostle screwed up quite as often as he...
Yeah, Simon Peter, he's great.
Yeah, if that's the rock we're on, no wonder it's so difficult.
Right?
Sorry, I know you're a successor of his, but, I'm going to lose my pension if I had one. So here's the only sort of slightly uncomfortable question. One person's bravery could be another person's bullying.
Sure.
One person's courage could be another person's hubris.
That's true.
There are people who would have thought that the President of the United States coming across Lafayette Square was doing a brave thing. Mm-hmm. They're probably not here tonight, but there may be some. It's low-hanging fruit, gang. Important question, though. Bravery can be used for ill. So walk us through the tensions there. And how do you know that your courage is based on a conviction that is in fact in tune with the gospel?
Right. As you speak, I'm thinking there must be a morally neutral dimension to something like courage in that, as you said, acts of bravery can be used for causes that are ultimately very harmful and destructive to other people. And yet it is the same well of human capacity that is being drawn on for that purpose. So in some ways, our constant work of self-knowledge and reflection and exposure to the ways that any one of us in our moments of so-called bravery can get caught up in things that are in fact not of God or that are harmful to human beings. And I dare say we do that more often than we realize. And that one things I write about, and I learned this early on when I was 17, that when I made my first conscious step into courage, that it's become like the archetype of my life. I wouldn't be the person here today if I hadn't made that choice, but there were adverse consequences to that choice. I harmed some people. I hurt people through that choice. There were long-lasting consequences that I could not be spared of. So even though it was in many ways life-affirming, there are other people in my life who might say, well, yeah, for you, but not for me. And so that's the moral ambiguity of human existence. And I dare say in your study of biography, you come across that a fair amount, where people are making very brave and life-affirming decisions, and yet there is a trail of carnage. And that's something that we have to acknowledge in all humility, that we may not know, and we're seeing by the lights we're given.
No, absolutely. I mean, your phrase "moral ambiguity" is exactly right. I think it was George Eliot who said that what do we live for but to make life less difficult for one another? But we have to do it in a world of dim lights and tangled circumstance. So, trying to see through dim lights and move through tangled circumstance. What surprised you as you were doing the book? Were there insights about your own experience? Were there elements in other people's stories that created a kind of epiphanic moment here or there?
Well, I learned you have to work a lot harder to get your sources right when you write a book. There's a lot of detail in, and there was something very humbling about that. Like there's a, if you're going to tell someone's story, and this was both for people that I asked for permission to tell their story, and then also in citing the works, written works of people from history, I had to get it. I had to make sure that I was telling the story as accurately from their perspective as I could, and that took. I mean, it was surprising just in terms of like how intense that process was. And so I would say that I learned a lot about making sure, because I tell people stories, I tell my own stories all the time on Sunday morning for 8 minutes, but it's a very different discipline when you're putting things in print. So that's one. The other piece, John, is I think what you were describing earlier is that there's a revelatory process for any one of us when we sit down or to do anything with intentional focus over a sustained period of time. You know, it's not like it wasn't one thing or another. And I had to lean a lot on the wisdom, I think it's Anne Lamott, about just taking very small chunks of the process and working it through. And so my family might be able to tell you about the summer of chapter 2, right? That's like that was all I was doing was chapter 2. And, you know, we'd have breakfast and I'd talk about Eleanor Roosevelt. And, you know, it was just that sense of like, okay, I've just got to work this through.
In my house, we call that Tuesday.
Tuesday, right? Yeah, well, and so that was, it's a humbling exercise to try and give voice, appropriate voice to stories that have been entrusted to you. And I was surprised by how long and how deep that has stayed with me.
So you write about grand moments and you write about the small, less kettle drum, fewer organ music playing in the background. To you, what was the most moving unknown story?
Well, that's a really good question.
I'm not asking you to pick a favorite child. Just what is one of the
Yeah,
moving...
no, I hear you. It's I think I found myself in a surprising way. I didn't intend to start out this way, but I realized in the writing about a third of the way through that the historical people I was drawn to were people I had known very little about before and who really were the precursors of the civil rights movement. So I spent a lot of time in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s with people like Howard Thurman and Thurgood Marshall, not when he was a Supreme Court justice, but when he was an attorney with the NAACP, going around the South, Jim Crow South, trying to save black men and women from being hanged, and losing as much as he was winning, but counting every victory as one chink in the armor against segregation and white supremacy, that there were these just amazing stories of people, Pauli Murray, Eleanor Roosevelt, and her decisions to stay married to FDR, to be at his side, to take on the mantle of that life and then make it her own, right? But just the countless decisions. And I think I found myself comforted because so much of what we're dealing with now, we're dealing with problems that I may not see the resolution. I mean, in my lifetime, I'm not convinced I'm going to see the victories that I would hope for. And to know that sometimes it's not your place, and that those were the people who I found great, real inspiration from, and their faithfulness in the long stretch of whatever life was given, you know, the path of life, the decades that were theirs to live in our country.
Moses versus Joshua.
Yeah, Moses in the wilderness. Yeah.
And the work of the apostles is fundamentally in that vernacular. The building of the church, the building of the nation, the articulation of the Declaration of Independence, but not its realization, were all brave acts where people did move on to their reward without seeing the fullest expression of that. So I'm imagining that part of your message is not to expect the perfect, but to strive for the good. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's right. And also that you said courage is the virtue that allows how did you say it? What did Aristotle say?
Well,
Courage.
Aristotle said it first, but I helped him a little
Courage
because he was a little weak on his Greek. So it's the virtue that guarantees all the others.
Well, and I would say perseverance is the virtue that guarantees all others, that there is something about perseverance. And you don't persevere when it's easy, you persevere when it's hard. And so I feel like that's, for me, the parallel to that. But I also wanted to write about the kinds of courage that, in the early stages of life, I'm in my 60s now, but in the early years of my life, most of my courageous moments, as I defined them, as I remember them, were about going and doing something, going somewhere, or, crossing a threshold, taking a step that moved me from one place to another. And then there were those years in my early 30s where that wasn't the call anymore. I wasn't sure what to do with this life that was so stable and so defined by relationships that didn't need, rushing off to the next courageous adventure. What it needed was stability and daily acts of love and faithfulness, and tending not to the realms of justice that I felt called to, but I was leading a church now, and we had to balance the budget and fix the roof and make sure that the teachers in Sunday school had what they needed, just the things that you do when you're a parish priest, and as a mom, caring for kids and being a good spouse to my husband. Like, there was just all these things that just said, okay, this is a call too of great courage. And when I've come to moments like that, it's a similar feeling, like this is the call. This is the courageous act, and no one needs to see it. No one's going to stand there and applaud and say, yeah, you were so brave. What a great breakfast you made this morning. It was just, but just that sense of, that was, and to honor that form of courage and allowing other people's lives to take center stage. That there's a courage that comes from recognizing that you're not the one always that needs to have all of your drama needs met, but right now your task is to ensure that other people can thrive and have their moments. And I'm considerably older than you are, but I'm at a stage in life now. John just celebrated a birthday, by the way. Happy birthday. Yep. And
we had an Aristotle cake. It was great.
Yeah, it was, but to say, there are times in life when you realize that it's really about putting wind in other people's sails, and that's also courage, and how not to be trite, but how the cycle of life calls us to different ways of being strong.
Do you find that almost everything you've spoken of does find expression, whether it's rooted in it or not? It finds expression, manifestation in the biblical story, in the principles that we're enjoined to act on. To link two parts, I think you'd agree that they're contiguous regions, but two regions, both your ecclesiastical role and your human personal role. In many ways, they met in June of 2020. I would argue they intersected. You were not, you might disagree with this, but you were not speaking ex cathedra as a bishop of the church. You were speaking as an American citizen and a leader of a particular body. As you've reflected on that, A, is there anything you would do differently? And B, what lessons would you have us take as we try to integrate the various parts of ourselves?
That's a great question. Life integration is the journey of a lifetime, right? And we have obviously different aspects of our being called into play in a given day, but the moments of real power is when we feel that. I don't know that if I actually felt that. I didn't feel much of anything in those days, to be honest. That was a time when I didn't have a lot of time, as I said. I didn't have time to think. This was not a time of thinking. This was a time of responding to a moment that was present. The arc of it all is perhaps where that fuller integration that you're speaking of happens. I would say, what I would hope people would take away from that moment, and perhaps every moment we're in right now, because we have so much that is at stake for us as a people, as a species, that while there are times when the healthiest thing to do, or the personally most important thing to do, is to seek safety and protection, that this is a time for the American citizenry to be brave. That there's a lot depending on us stepping up. And so one of the things I was hoping for is simply to normalize that experience, to say there are lots of ways it happens. Sometimes you step up and you feel really prepared, like I can do this because I've been preparing my whole life for this. And other times you're completely not prepared, and it doesn't matter. You're the one who has to step up anyway, right? So if you're gonna fail, go ahead, fail, but get out there. And then the third is when it's just, you're in your own ambiguous, morally complicated, self-obsessed space, and God invites you to step out of all of that and think about something else for a while and do something good for somebody else. And I think in all of those ways we can be called. And I just hope that enough of us do that. So and not just for the country, but for your communities and for your families, for life in general, for each one of us to believe that we all have the stuff of courage inside us. And it doesn't have to be only for those that we would describe as the truly brave. That's what I would say.
A crucial element of our faith, of our common vernacular, is that it's not simply the princes and the prelates, it's the people.
Yeah.
And in fact, if it weren't for the people, the princes and the prelates couldn't do what they did. There's that mysterious commerce that unfolds.
My teacher used to say that running a church would be easy if it weren't for all the people.
That is true of almost everything.
And but then what's the church for? It's like, ships are safest when they're in the harbor, but that's not what, what I mean? It's like,
Sure.
So it's just. But
democracy would be great, except for all of the people.
If it were, so it's there's just a mess. I mean, the mess of human beings is the stuff from which courage is born. And the other thing too is. Maybe one of the things, I hadn't thought about this till just now, I'd love to dispel the notion in myself, first of all, and with anyone else who has this same malady, to think that getting it right is the most important thing. And sometimes I don't think it matters if we get it right. I think it's, are we willing to take the risk to step into spaces and even be willing to fail? You know, that even that has a nobility about it if it is toward the good. Or I think it was Mariann Edelman who said, I'd rather fail at the things that matter than be successful in the things that aren't important, you know, or are less important. And so to just keep our eyes on the things that we would feel really glad about when our days end, that we were there, you know, that we were there.
That's true. I will also say that, you know, I've known a lot of politicians who would say they would really rather just be right than win, but I think they've been lying. And so...
Well, there's that.
They bear false witness. That's the way y'all put it.
Well, and that's part of it too, right? Maybe I would too. You know, yeah. It's yeah.
And I think it was Robert Louis Stevenson who said, "The duty of the Christian is not to succeed, but to fail cheerfully." But it's the only definition by which I'm a good Christian. But talk about that, because the downside, the pit you feel in your stomach, the warmth of blushing when you haven't gotten something quite right.
Oh, it's awful.
Are so real.
Oh.
It's tactile.
Yeah, it's visceral.
And so you're a preacher of the gospel. What's your message to... It's easy to say, don't be afraid to fail. A lot of coffee mugs say that. But it's much easier said than done. I know in my own life, I mean, I love to say that. I make mistakes all the time. I've made 6 in the past 12 minutes, I'm sure. But as I feel okay if I say that, I'd rather not have you say that. And I think that that's particularly at this hour, which is really American democracy's hour of maximum danger, certainly since the 1850s. It's so important to make it safe for people to come up short and to forgive and let people back in.
Right.
I think one of the most difficult things we're dealing with as a country right now is that folks, to use secular political terms, folks in the center and left of the country are being asked to be like the father in the prodigal son. If people turn and come back, we're just supposed to celebrate, as opposed to demanding some kind of accountability. Can you have reconciliation without confession?
Okay, you've just put a lot on the table here. Let's see it.
We can go back to my failing cheerfully.
Yeah, I would see it. Yeah, well, let me just say that I also fail a lot, and sometimes I fail spectacularly and publicly, and there is just no there's no shortcut for whatever process you have to go through to work your way through that, right? You just have to work your way through it. And each of us is wired differently, so I suppose it lands differently with other people. It hits me really hard. Hits me really, really hard, and I hate going through it. I've also learned that going through it is the price I need to pay. And particularly now, because I get things wrong a lot in the public arena, particularly around issues of racial reconciliation, and because it's just what I don't know fills volumes. But what I've learned is that feeling, if I quit because it makes me uncomfortable, or I can't live with myself with that feeling of failure, then I am absenting myself from my own growth and also my part to play in the healing process. So I wish I could say to myself and to other people, you know, you don't have to feel what you feel when you fail. I can't stop how I feel, but I realize I have to offer that in some ways to God and to my compassionate family and friends who will remind me that I'm still lovable even if I've made mistakes, and just get over it, however long it takes, and show up again. because that's the work. And frankly, and people say this to people like you and me with white, who are recognized or identify as white, that it's a sign of privilege, actually, if you can quit when your feelings are hurt or when you feel badly about having failed, right? Like, you get to walk away. A lot of people don't get to walk away, so what makes you so chin up? And actually, the people who say that to me when I'm groveling in my, oh, I'm a failure, it's like, chin up, girl. Those are the people that actually help me more, in the sense of like, yeah, this is the path. This is the path of courage, not trying and being brave and succeeding, but trying, being brave, failing, getting up and trying again, failing again, getting up, maybe making progress the third or fourth time, right?
No, that's brilliantly put. To take your toys and go home presupposes you have toys and a home.
And a home, right? Shall I?
Please.
This is the last part.
The epistle is found in the...
This is from the Epilogue. To this day, people still approach me in the supermarket, at church conferences, or while I'm walking through my neighborhood, wanting to talk about the day former President Trump held a Bible outside St. John's Church. Whenever I'm introduced at a public event, my response to his actions is mentioned as if it were the most noteworthy event in my ordained ministry. And in these pages, I've sought to place the events of June 1st, 2020, within a larger context, exploring how we learn to be brave over the course of a lifetime in all aspects of life, and especially when the courageous decisions we make are known only to God. Now, in my 7th decade, I think a lot about how to speak of the challenges of our time with honesty but not despair, with a sober assessment of the problems we face, and still with genuine hope for our future as a nation and as a species. It isn't easy, for the divisions in our country have only deepened since President Trump left office in January of 2021. And meanwhile, on the global stage, there are wars in many lands, large-scale migration on nearly every continent, and an ecological crisis imperiling the future of all humankind. What I keep coming back to as a source of hope and strength are the historical accounts of men and women who faced the challenges of their time with grit and grace, the timeless stories of our spiritual and literary traditions that embody courage for all of us, the people in my life whose courage and sacrificial love I admire, and the moments I have felt summoned to do what I felt impossible at the time. Sometimes I succeeded, often I failed. But what seems to matter most in those moments is that we show up, step up, and make our offering, despite its limitations, and our own. Very kind.
Thank you, my dear. Now for the real questions. All right, let's see. How do I get to heaven? No, that's not.
Turn left at Defense Circle.
Turn left, really?
Turn left.
Let's not play to stereotype. What is your counsel to philanthropists who want to foster civil discourse and build more community connections across divergent views?
To philanthropists. Well, first of all, thank you for asking the question. Second, I would say go where the pain is. Go where the pain is and get to know the people who are ministering and giving and offering themselves in service as close and as proximate to whatever pain it is that you feel called in your heart to respond to.
You mentioned the Jesuits. how much from Ignatian discernment, and I'm really just reading this because how often do you get to say Ignatian discernment, just as a basic rule, do you see in the decision-making you describe?
Quite a bit. I'm one of the people who are the spiritual wisdom person in my life is a Jesuit priest, and so I am learning more and more through his counsel and for some readings to see the arc of, there are certain things that St. Ignatian said that I think are particularly relevant to what we've been talking about. One is the core conviction that we find God present in all things, in all aspects of life. So there isn't a division between God and religion and spirituality and the rest of life. It's all one. And then the second, there are these ebbs and flows, as I mentioned earlier, of consolation and desolation. And Ignatius was very clear to, in a time of consolation, which he describes as when you're like really at the top of your game and you're feeling that God is blessing you and you're just hitting all the notes, to be grateful for that, but to remember that it is short-lived and that there will follow a time of desolation or a dark night of the soul, to use another frame, or a time when the lights go out for you and you feel bereft and that God has abandoned you. And in those moments, Ignatius would say, remember your times of consolation and do not make foolish decisions. Do not make many decisions in those times. So he's very wise that way, but also to trust the rhythm and the back and forth of life. So those are some areas. I'm not a Ignatian practitioner, but I find those principles to be very, very helpful.
This is a pastoral question, which you deal with in the book so well. Can you provide some thought or insight into the courage of facing one's own death and how faith can provide strength? Both death and chronic pain, the physical manifestations of incompleteness.
I so appreciate that question, and we haven't talked about it here tonight, but I dedicate a whole chapter to the things we do not choose, accepting the things we do not choose, chronic pain being one of them, and what it's like to live with chronic pain and to learn to live with pain. And so let's just start there and to say one of the lessons I've learned through that journey is that I had to accept the pain for what it was. I couldn't will it away. I couldn't work it away. I had to accept it, which didn't mean that I liked it or I wasn't trying to get better, but I had to start from a place of acceptance, and to acceptance of suffering as a mystery of the human experience. And what Dr. King called redemptive suffering, the suffering that we can either actively choose or accept as, and to put ourselves in a posture where we allow suffering to change us and to, as my director would say, stretch our hearts and allow us to become more human and more compassionate and more attuned to the role that real suffering plays in a human life. Sometimes it can be resolved and sometimes it can't. And death being the ultimate threshold, the ultimate mystery, the thing that we are in some ways created to fight against, because everything in us while we are alive is oriented toward life and choosing life and claiming life and even fighting for our lives, as we should. Until that time comes when that's not the option that's given to us anymore. And it happens to all of us, it happens in different ways. And for those for whom the consciousness of that journey is long, in other words, there's a process of living with the knowledge that whatever it is happening will be the most likely end of their physical life. There is a courage that is, you can't you can't ever say to another person any of the things that would be horrible platitudes if you said them, but when they come back to you from someone who's living the experience, there's a resonance of truth and freedom that is hard-won, and not a universal experience, but it does give you a sense that there is life on the other side of the deaths that we experience as we live, which gives us some reassurance that this is not the end, and that there is even, and I say this with some reservation because I'm not facing that in my own life right now, but there is something about that experience that when people live through it, like facing the death of a loved one or coming close to their own mortality, that something shifts in their being that is they're just changed. They're changed as human beings, and it's amazing to behold. It doesn't always mean they're, I'm not talking better, worse. Sometimes I have a friend, for example, who many of you know, our good friend Paula Clark, who is now the Bishop of the Diocese of Chicago and has gone through more losses in a given year, both physical and relational, than any human being can bear. She's the bishop, and she's leading with such grace and courage. But I was with her last week, and she said something that I think people will say, and I just listened to it with all. She says, there's just a lot of things I used to care about that I just don't care about anymore. And she wasn't talking about the big things. She was talking about the things that you just don't have time for anymore. And there's that sense of, I am going to live every moment I have with as much awareness and gratitude and intention as I can. And when you hear that come out of someone's being, you know that in some ways death is not the end. But what happens on the other side of that threshold, we will find out when we get there. And until then, I think we live with mystery and if God willing, with God willing, hope. And bless you, whoever asked that question, because I doubt it was made in the abstract.
A final question, which is better than anything I've asked. Is it brave to push on and do a hard thing when it seems there is no other choice? Or did you conclude there is no other choice because you are brave? Which is kind of annoying, whoever asked that, because it's a hell of a lot more interesting than what I said.
Read that question again. That's a really great question. Please. Read it again.
Is it brave to push on and do a hard thing when it seems there is no other choice? Got that one? Or do you conclude there is no other choice because you are brave?
Huh.
I can read it in Greek. I can do whatever you need.
I would say a definite yes to the first, that it is brave to continue even when you feel there is no choice. And the second part was?
Do you conclude there is no other choice because you are brave? Does your bravery lead you?
I would say in some instances that has been my experience, that's the choice. So I would say yes and yes. And yeah, those are great questions. I want to just say one thing. When I was telling one of my friends about the different chapters in this book, she said, what about the decision to stop? Which is not in the book. And I do want to say that I think sometimes deciding to stop something is also brave, right? I write about deciding to go, deciding to say, deciding to start, but also when you come to the place when, and I'm not just saying this because it's time for us to stop, but I think that but it is. But for those, there are those times when it's time to lay something down, right? Or to let something go. And that is also very brave, and sometimes maybe the bravest thing of all.
Given that we're in the city we're in, there is nothing harder in American history than to end a war. There's nothing braver than to know when to stop. And nobody gives you a lot of oil paintings for that. And there's not a parade. It's much easier in American history to start a war than to stop one. Which is not to say that the starting is wrong, but I think one of the gifts you've given us is to understand courage not simply as the Hollywood version. This is not Top Gun. This is an hourly struggle, near and far. Thank you, Bishop, would you bless us on our way?
Well, first of all, can I thank you all for coming again? It was really amazing to... You're amazing. So, remember that God has no hands and feet on earth now but ours. And that ours are the hands with which God works, ours are the feet on which God moves, ours the eyes through which God sees, the lips through which God speaks to this world in compassion and kindness. So go forth from this place and into your lives, filled with the Spirit and the love of God, into your worlds with kindness. And as you go, may the blessing of God Almighty, Creator, Christ, Holy Spirit, go with you and remain with you this day and always. Amen. But there are refreshments in the back, so please stay for a bit and enjoy each other's company.